Well, first of all, you can only imagine, any of you who know my work, how absolutely thrilled and excited to be here today and have the honor and privilege of moderating this session with Masazumi Wakatabe, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Japan. One of the things that I think is so interesting about him, and of course, any central bank, certainly the Bank of Japan, every member brings something special to the table. That is what the people who appoint them hope. And he did not start out as a central banker. He did not start out in financial markets. He came from the academic side, and as I understand it, he became increasingly involved in these very important issues facing Japan when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the kind of things he's going to be speaking about today. And that is the step that led him to this very important seat he fills now. Without further ado, let me invite him to present his remarks.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Catherine, for the kind introduction. So it is a very great honor to have the opportunity to speak to you here at the Distinguished Japan Society. Now, the question is, has Japan's economy changed? My answer is both yes and no. The economy has been changing in a positive manner, but the change is far from over. I would like to talk about the changes in today's Japan's economy and its challenges from a somewhat longer-term perspective. I know some of you, most of you, have sort of questions about the current sort of ongoing things, the situation. But I think I will, talk about a little bit from a longer perspective, and then I will cover sort of the short-term questions in the Q&A session if time allows. Now, there is some quote. Because Japan has experienced a decades-long stagnation, today's society is a very difficult place to live for you. So this phrase comes from a children's educational comic book published in August 2013. I wish really I could show you the picture because picture talks a lot more than the words. But I'm just worried about the copyright infringement, so that I don't present. And you must note that that there is comic book or a manga for everything in Japan. So for example, I learned Japanese history, world history from manga, comic. And this is interesting because this is a comic book, educational comic book about the Japanese Buddhist philosopher, Kitaro Nishida. So that somehow this phrase comes up in that book about the Japanese Buddhist philosopher. I could talk more about that, but that's just a detail, so I will skip that. So, but anyway, that this phrase reflects a sort of general mood by that time, back in the 2013. So that that the economy was still under prolonged deflation and stagnation. So about 30 years have passed since the early 1990s when the asset price bubble collapsed in Japan. Looking back, this 30-year period can be roughly divided into three separate sub-decades. In the first decade, the aggregate demand fell after the collapse of the bubble economy. The so-called three excesses of corporate debt, production capacity, and employment materialized. And attention was drawn to the non-performing loan program of financial institutions. In the following decade, the next decade, although the disposal of non-performing loans proceeded on course, the economic growth rate remained low. Also, deflation became a problem with the annual CPI inflation rate. That's a usual measure for measuring inflation in Japan. Staying in negative territory. These 2 decades are sometimes called Japan's lost 2 decades. And the last decade is a period from the early 2010s up to the present. By the way, my talk, my speech draft and all slides will be available on the BOJ website. So unless you would like to take a picture of me, you don't have to take the picture here. Now, as there has been a lively discussion on why Japan's economy remained stagnant for such a long time, as the lost 2 decades after the collapse of the bubble economy, I will not go into the detail. Now, some would say I would get a job because I have a very strong opinion about that particular aspect. If you're interested in my view, you can read my book in English. So instead of an introduction, I'd like to discuss Japan's declining and aging population. So that's which has been considered as to be not only one of the factors behind the lost 2 decades, but also highly likely to continue. So many people now talk about the declining and aging population, like sort of the cliche. So that, that because of that, Japan has challenges. But I'd like to argue otherwise. Japan's economy has faced the structural problem of decline in working age population since the mid-90s. So then comes my first slide. Oops, yes, demographics. So that's the total population in the left-hand side, yeah, this one, has been declining, started to decline in the 2010s. But the working age population aged 15 to 64 in the right chart here started to, which is the major source of the labor supply, already began to decrease in the mid-1990s. So that, in other words, since the mid-1990s, Japan has remained in a period of so-called demographic onus, not the bonus, it's onus, where the working age population declines at a faster pace than that of the total population. So this stands in the contrast to the here in the United States, where both the total population and the working age population have continued to increase consistently. By the way, I think that's we have to make a slight adjustment in this the current juncture. I think that's even in the United States, that the population growth rate has been a little bit sluggish. Now, the decline in the working age population has been pointed to as one of the reasons behind the stagnant economic activity in Japan the last 2 decades. Now move on to the next slide. In fact, when we decompose Japan's potential growth rate into the number of employed persons, hours worked, capital stock, and total factor productivity, we can find in this chart that the number of employed persons contribute negatively from the late 1990s, through the late 2000s. The decline in the working age population is considered to lie behind this development. So you can see this the negative thing here. That's the contribution of the sort of demographic factors. That said, I believe the negative effects on the economy of a declining and aging population have been rather exaggerated. First of all, as chart 2, this chart shows the contribution of demographics, the contribution of the number of employed persons is not so significant. It is negative, but it's not so big. And also, historically speaking, that's this slide. You see that throughout the post-World War II era, an increase in capital stock and TFP. TFP is a measurement of the sort of the productivity of the overall economy. Has contributed more than a change in the labor input to a rise in the economic growth rate. So we, customary talk about sort of high economic growth era of the 1960s or a stable growth era of 1970s and the bubble economy of 1980s. But during these periods, demographics actually contribute very little. So what matters is more or less like capital stock and productivity. Also, international comparisons show no evidence that a declining and aging population leads to a decline in the per capita growth rate. Actually, in the economy as a whole, maybe it's not growing, but per capita, per working age population or per population, the growth rate may not sort of decelerate, even the population, declines and also the ages. In addition, there are a number of transmission mechanisms through which a declining and aging population can affect the economy. So that's the next slide. Admittedly, as in the left of the slide, a decline in the working age population could exert downward pressure on economic growth, since the labor supply will decrease. So that's a kind of the most obvious part of the equation. Furthermore, investment may be reduced as firms and individuals expect continuous depopulation and slower economic growth accordingly. Okay. However, the impact of the decline in the working age population on the economy will not necessarily be negative. The right-hand side of the slide shows that we can think of the positive sort of mechanism. Now, for example, in response to the decline, those who used to be outside the labor market may start working, and their potential may be unlocked. If this happens, the positive impact on the economy can offset the negative impact. Also, firms may promote innovation and increase labor-saving investment in such areas as information and communication technology, as well as artificial intelligence, in order to make more effective use of scarce labor. If such developments improve the overall productivity, the economy can continue growing, even in the face of the structural problem of declining and aging population. Now, what has actually happened in Japan in recent years? So that's the next one. The economy was in a period of prolonged deflation in the second half of the last 2 decades. That is from the late 1990s through the early 2010s. So as you can see in the left chart, the output gap remained in negative territory for a long period. And in the right chart, the CPI, the inflation, continued to decline at an annual pace of around 0.4% on average. So the output gap is the measurement of how the economy is doing. So the output gap is in the sort of the positive region. That means that the demand is bigger than the sort of supply for the economy as a whole. So that's occasionally that is associated with boom period. So you can see that the output gap would be negative during this period with some sort of intervening years. And also that the deflation has been persistent throughout the late 1990s to the 2000s. So that's the picture. However, Japan's economy has improved significantly since the early 2010s, when the Bank of Japan introduced quantitative and qualitative monetary easing, the so-called QQE, which differs considerably from the past policy frameworks. So the output gap has improved for the past few years, taking hold in positive territory. That's this is area we are talking about. The economy is no longer in deflation in the sense of a sustained decline in the CPI. So inflation rate has become positive. It's slightly positive, but positive nonetheless. Thus, you can see that Japan's economic activity and prices have improved clearly, although the declining and aging population has continued to weigh on the economy in a structured manner. So what's happening is that that we keep blaming the aging and declining population for Japan's stagnation, but actually we can do better even with those problems. So in the next part of this speech, let me describe the positive changes in Japan's economy by comparing the present situation with the last 2 decades or under deflation. I sometimes feel that many people do not necessarily have an accurate picture of the current state of Japan's economy, since they have a deeply entrenched negative image of the bubble burst and deflation, as well as the current declining and aging population. Thus, I will elaborate on the positive changes in Japan's economy in the hope that you will better understand the current situation. On that basis, I will also talk about the challenges. I personally think that economic growth and price stability can be achieved, even given the structural problem of declining and aging population. That said, it is true that there are many challenges to be tackled beforehand. So I would like to share my opinions on these challenges, which should be addressed with a view to ensuring further strengths in Japan's economy. So the next section, I'm going to talk about achievements and changes, and the section after the next section, I will talk about some challenges. So first, let us take a look at changes in household income as a whole. So this is the slide. Nominal disposable income. That's the kind of amount of salaries and bonuses and interest payments you get, and you deduce, some taxes and social insurance contribution. So that's the net amount you get after you work or you invest your money. So during this period, real disposable income, adjusted for inflation, increased moderately because prices continue to decline somewhat. So the nominal, amount may be stagnant, but the real term, you may say there was an improvement. However, that's a kind of awkward argument for you because households could not feel the increase in their income as nominal disposable income did not increase. So let's say, you get sort of 10 million yen and your income stays there. And, that's, let's assure there's a deflation so that your real income is actually, increasing. People would not buy that argument, So that's the one factor we should consider. So, but what happened is that since the mid-2010s, there has been a notable change as disposable income has increased clearly in both nominal and real terms. So that now we have this the two things that's increasing simultaneously. How have people perceived this change? In a public opinion survey, people were asked how satisfied they are with their current lives. I can admit that the life is tough. Life is not so good, so that's many challenges there. But we can see that the proportion of respondents answering that they were satisfied declined clearly from the late 1990s to a level below that in the 1980s. So this survey result shows something. However, it has increased notably since the early 2010s and recently registered a record high. By the way, so there is some technical issue because that we have changed. This survey changed the sort of the people who answered the question from the people from of 20 years or older to 18 years to older. So there is a slight discrepancy there, but that's very small point. What we can see is there is a sort of now increasing trend in terms of life satisfaction. Okay. Now, this improvement of people's satisfaction with their lives is likely due to an increase in their income, stemming from economic improvement. In fact, in the same public opinion survey, the red line in the same chart, the proportion of respondents answering satisfied their income also rose significantly. So that there is a clear sort of a correlation in terms of this survey result. Now, to see how far economic improvement has spread to household, I would like to look at the poverty rate in this chart. The poverty rate for all households has peaked out in recent years. Unfortunately, we had seen a sort of increase in both in the poverty rate and child poverty rate. So, in particular nowadays, that the child poverty rate has started to decline. So, Of course, there is a room, lots of room for improvement regarding the problem of poverty in Japan, but it is suggested that improvement to financial conditions for a wide range of households is already happening, albeit gradually. What lies behind the improvement in people's satisfaction with lives? So the answer is changes in labor market conditions. That is, people work more, and people actually get work, the jobs. The unemployment rate, the left chart, has declined recently around half the level of the deflation period. The most recent figure is 2.2% for Japan. So it's not a bad number at all, but I'd like to pay more attention to the right graph, so that since the working age population has continued to decline in Japan, some may suspect that this is just due to a decline in labor supply. It's people are not, the number of people is shrinking, so that people may have a bit easier time to get jobs. But that's actually not true. We have a constant declining population and a reversal of the labor force participation. So you can see in the shaded area in this chart, that's here, that the improvement in the employment situation since the early 2010s has been accompanied by an increase in the number of employed persons. So this implies that the recent tightening of labor market conditions is mainly due to an increase in labor demand, not a decline in labor supply. This improvement in the employment situation has brought about an increase in household income, with the number of employed persons increasing and wages rising, albeit moderately. So what's happening is that even the population is declining, more and more people are getting jobs, and more people are working. Okay. Why has the number of employed persons been increasing despite the declining working age population? The answer is a significant increase in labor participation by women and seniors. So chart 9 shows developments in the number of labor force participants and the labor force participation rates for working age men and women, as well as seniors aged 65 and over. The labor force participation rate for each group is defined as a ratio of labor force participation rate, the labor force participants to the respective population. In the past few years, the labor force participation rate of working age men, the black line in the left graph here, has increased somewhat while being at a high level. So those people, the working age men, have already worked and still working. Meanwhile, the number of labor force participants among this group has been decreasing, though along with the decline in the overall working age population. So in contrast, the labor force participation rate of working age women has been rising constantly. So that's a black line in the center. So now we have sort of a huge increase in the working labor force participation for the female. Now, through 2012, the number of labor force participants among this group decreased as the impact of the decline in the overall working age population was large. Yes, something is happening. Is there any question for me? So please hold on the questions, okay? It's not a question time yet. Since 2013, however, the number has started to increase as labor participation by women has accelerated further. As for seniors in the right chart, so this is the seniors. Okay. The number of labor force participants the bar graph increased for a while after the mid-2000s, along with a rise in the elderly population. Even with that rise in the black line, their labor force participation rate. Since 2013, the bar graph, has been increasing at a faster pace as seniors have become more active in participating in the labor market. As we have just seen, labor participation by women and seniors has increased considerably, and this is a significant change observed in the labor market since the early 2010s. So that lies behind the change in the employment figure. So what then has prompted the more women and seniors to enter the labor market in Japan? In the case of women, I first need to explain the past situation of their labor participation. Let's move on to the next slide. So please look at the left graph. So this is a kind of similar, the familiar figure for those who know something about the labor market in Japan. So looking at the labor force participation rate of women by age group, the so-called M-shaped curve, that's it used to be an M-shaped curve, was evident in the late 1990s, as the rate was lower at the life stage of childbirth and child rearing, this period. This is because when working women in Japan reached this life stage, there was a strong tendency to give up continuing to work and leave the labor market. Recently, however, it can be said that women at this life stage continue to participate in the labor market, and therefore the curve is generally no longer M-shaped. So there is a change, and M to kind of flat shaped, I don't know, it's like pie shaped curve. So for almost all age groups, women's labor force participation rates in Japan now exceed those in the United States. In Japan, women's labor participation has been encouraged by a rise in labor demand due to economic improvement, as well as by enhancement of the surrounding environment through various measures taken by both the public and corporate sectors, so that women can balance child rearing and career. In fact, as you can see as a red line in the right chart, local governments have increased the provision of nursery facilities, and the firms have actually set up child care centers at their workplace in an effort to avoid losing female employees who are raising children. So actually BOJ also had child care facility. More firms have offered further support for parental leave and introduced teleworking systems to allow employees to work at home without the burden of commuting. If you have any chance to live in the city, urban areas of Japan, that's commuting is just really painful. So that's we'd like to reduce that pain. So that's what's happening now. Thanks to these initiatives, fewer women now leave the labor market to raise children, as shown in the blue line, having declined steadily. Next, the left graph in chart 11 shows change in the number of labor force participants among seniors, broken down into smaller age groups. You can see that labor force participation has increased not only for those aged 65 to 69, but also for those aged 70 and over. So this increase may be partly due to financial reasons, such as incremental rise in the pension age, but that alone is not a sufficient reason. So at the right graph shows, as people get older, they don't tend to work for non-economic reasons, such as to find fulfillment in life or to make a social contribution. From another perspective, this is actually kind of interesting. The slowing physical aging seems to help seniors to continue working. So seniors are becoming healthier. Now, this chart shows that compared with a decade ago, so for example, they have become physically younger by about 5 years based on their walking speed, and by about 10 years based on their number of teeth. Okay. So these changes in physical ability mean that it is not unnatural for people to continue working in their 70s, even though a decade ago it was regarded as a natural that they retire at the age of 65. So this is really comforting for someone like me. I'm also aging, so that's I have some room to work in down the road. In Japan, where the working age population has been decreasing, an increase in labor participation by women and seniors is welcome in terms of accelerating economic growth. However, having said that, their labor force participation rates cannot exceed 100%. So what we need to do now is to improve the productivity of the overall economy. So I'll come back to this point later. So I will talk now about the firm's behavior. So I have talked about the household behavior. So the another side is firm's behavior. So there also I can see signs of change are seen. Firms have proactively responded to labor shortages. Amid tight labor market conditions, firms have increased labor-saving investment to save human resources and have used capital as a substitute. In Japan's manufacturing sector, there has been active labor-saving investment. Based on the tough experience of the surges in crude oil prices during 2 oil crises in the 1970s, manufacturers have taken initiative since the 1980s to cut costs and to streamline production processes, for example, by introducing production robots. In the face of globalization, large manufacturing firms exposed to severe competition, in particular, have continued to make such efforts. By contrast, in the non-manufacturing sector, where many industries are labor-intensive, firms seemed less enthusiastic about undertaking labor-saving investment. This is partly because they were able to take advantage of a stable supply of low-wage workers, such as part-timers, and did not face such fierce global competition. So during the stagnant years, that you can actually hire, you could really hire, many people at lower costs. But that's no longer true. So, however, reflecting the recent tight labor market condition, labor-sensitive non-manufacturers have begun working towards saving labor. Since the early 2010s, labor-intensive industries such as construction, retailing, and accommodations, eating and drinking services have been actively making labor-saving investment, as you can see in the left graph, from the clear increase in the software investment. So you see that there is a huge surge in the investment in the software. For example, even at small restaurants in Japan, what we call izakaya, you can see tablet computers at your table, allowing you to order just by tapping. Okay. So this kind of system helps restaurants to save labor in taking orders from customers and improve efficiency in sales management. Construction sites, which have also faced labor shortage, have been adopting new technologies. One example is the introduction of a survey system using drones. Another is the use of AI, artificial intelligence, to analyze, accumulate information to complement operations which used to rely largely on skilled workers' experience. The clear rise in labor productivity since the early 2010s, as you can see in the right graph, appears to reflect these initiatives by firms enabled by remarkable technological progress in recent years. I come back to the question of the productivity in more detail. And also we have a sense that labor productivity in Japan is quite low, but actually it's rising because that's the labor productivity is a kind of output divided by the working age workers. So that part is increasing. That's when we talk about overall productivity, we need another measure. We'll come back to that point later. But this is the picture we have. So the labor productivity is increasing. Now, the changes that I have just outlined may be seen as a passive response to labor tightening. But you can find a more proactive increase in the number of mergers and acquisitions. The blue line in the left chart, made by Japanese firms, although their total value, the orange bar graph, has fluctuated considerably due to some large-scale M&As. Moreover, although the firm's entry rate, shown in the right graph, was low during the last 2 decades, it seems that there have been signs of a rise recently, albeit at a lower level than that of the United States. I think that the expansion of such initiatives can be seen as a positive change for Japanese firms, which used to be considered cautious about taking risks after the collapse of the bubble economy. So far, I have talked about the positive changes in Japan's economy after the last 2 decades. So its growth potential, however, needs to be further enhanced. Moreover, we are still only halfway toward achieving the Bank of Japan's price stability target of 2%. I think that there are still many challenges to be addressed in raising Japan's growth potential. In the remaining part of my speech, I would like to focus on the challenges toward raising productivity in Japan's economy amid a declining and aging population. So in order to improve productivity, it is necessary to invest in human resources so that more and more people can enhance their knowledge and skills. It is also important to create and maintain the so-called open economic and social systems that encourage people to make the best use of their abilities. Now, I'm going to talk about the expected change in the corporate sector first, and then I'll talk about the expected changes in the household sector. As I mentioned earlier, the firm's efforts to raise labor productivity by, for example, making labor-saving investment have spread not only to the manufacturing sector, but also to the non-manufacturing sector. However, even if labor productivity rises, as I show, there is no guarantee that the overall productivity of the economy, including capital productivity, will increase. So let us consider the case where capital such as robots substitutes for labor. If this is a mere substitution of 1 unit of labor with 1 unit of capital, and the value added remains the same, the overall productivity will not change substantially because labor productivity will rise while capital productivity declines. So that if the value added remains constant, then even though you have an increase in the labor productivity, if the productivity of capital goes down, then actually you cannot say that the overall productivity has increased. So in fact, the developments in TFP, that's the measure for the overall productivity, of various production factors, including effective use of capital, have differed from developments in labor productivity growth, which has increased significantly. As shown in the left table, the TFP growth has been relatively high in the IT producing sector, such as the manufacturers of electronic parts and electronic machinery. In contrast, growth has been sluggish in the IT using sector, which includes most of the non-manufacturing industry, with a high ratio of software investment to overall investment, such as information and communications, transport and postal services, as well as wholesale and retail trade. So while the deceleration in TFP growth has become a common concern among advanced economies, let's face it, it's happening all over the world. So productive slowdown is a sort of global problem. But even so, the TFP growth has remained low in Japan's IT using sector since 2000. Among the many hypotheses proposed to explain this low growth, I would like to focus on the stance of Japanese firms towards the use of IT. The right graph shows that according to survey asking Japanese firms why they have increased their IT-related budget, many answer that it is to improve business efficiency and cut costs. This is in contrast with US firms, which have incorporated new technology to encourage innovative initiatives, such as developing products and services. Although an increasing number of Japanese firms have recently started to try new technologies, not many seem to have made them work for successful innovation. But actually, we can see some changes still already. So the Japan 2013 and Japan 2017, you may see some sort of changes to the direction of using IT as a more sort of innovative way. Okay. But it's not at the level of the United States. We should admit that. So there's a challenge. So new technologies such as AI and Internet of Things, IoT, continue to make rapid progress. I hope that Japanese firms will adopt those technologies, not only to cut costs and streamline production processes, which they are good at, but also make more active use of them to enhance the value added through innovation. Okay. Now, I think the time is kind of running very fast, so I will quickly move on to the household sector. Now, what change is expected in the household sector with a view to improving productivity? The increased labor participation by women and seniors is a very positive development for Japan's economy, given the decline in the working age population. The next step is to fully unlock Japan's potential, the people's potential. So in the following, I'd like to focus on the challenges toward encouraging a greater contribution by women and young. Let me start with the issue of unlocking women's potential. So I would like to first look at development in the income levels of men and women over their lifetime. The diagram shows. We can see that women's income level clearly falls behind men's as they get older. One possible reason is that in the past, the university enrollment of women was relatively low compared to that of men. So, and another reason is that women may have less chance to develop their job skills, since they tend to give up continuing to work in order to raise children. So with regard to women's job skills, I'd like to show an analysis of the gap in literacy between men and women. So as you can see in the left graph, across country, this is an OECD study. There is no significant gender gap in the level of literacy. So as for the frequency of skill use in the workplace, in the right graph, the gender gap is more evident in Japan than in other countries. So in Japan, that women use their literacy at work much less frequently than men, suggesting that women are less likely to be assigned highly skilled tasks. But that's okay, we have lots of room to improve, okay? As these observations improve, I think that women's potential has not yet been fully unlocked in Japan. For example, while the proportion of women to total employed persons, the blue line, the red bar the blue bar in the left graph is comparable to that of other countries, the proportion of women in managerial positions, the red bar in the same chart, is clearly lower. So in addition, surveys on the underutilization of labor show in the right graph that many women wish to increase their working hours, particularly middle-aged women who have completed the early stages of child rearing. There seems to be quite a few women who want to return to a full-time job after child rearing but are unable to do so. Given the declining and aging population in Japan, it is essential that women not only enter the labor market but use their abilities to the fullest extent. Is Japan leading in this direction? With regard to the educational environment before becoming employed, shown in the left chart, 30 years ago, the percentage of women enrolled in a four-year university was only half of that of men. But in recent years, it has risen to a level comparative to that of men. Thus, as far as for the pre-employment education, it can be said that gender gap has been generally eliminated. In addition, as the right chart shows, although the employment rate for women tended to be lower than that for men, it has recently exceeded that for men. Moreover, an increased number of firms have been providing learning opportunities for women during their parental leave so that they can maintain and improve their skills. There has also been an increase in the firm's initiatives to share work-related information with women on parental leave so that they can catch up more easily when they return to work. As these examples showed, it seems that an environment is being created to encourage women to make full use of their abilities. Now, of course, there are still many women who have completed their child rearing but have given up to or rejoining the labor market. It is also important to provide these women with recurrent education to enable them to improve their skills and take positions requiring high skills when they re-enter the labor market. Next, I'd like to move on to the young. From a long-term perspective, education is extremely important in improving productivity. Coming from an academic background, that I welcome, this the direction. Macroeconomic productivity benefits from creating an environment that enables children to become better educated regardless of their economic conditions by, for example, providing free education, which is happening in Japan. Given the globalization of corporate activities, education is also key to developing internationally competent talent. On this point, I'd like to show you some data regarding the number of Japanese students studying abroad. As in the left chart, the percentage of Japanese students enrolled in foreign schools peaked out in the 2000s. However, please look at the right chart. The number of students studying abroad for shorter periods while enrolled at Japanese universities has continued to increase. So that we have a kind of interesting trend that actually it's more Japanese students go abroad, but for shorter periods. Now, probably due to that the universities in Japan have already established such a sort of venue for students. So this can be viewed in a number of ways, but I think that the fact that an increasing number of young people in Japan have experienced studying abroad, even if only for a short time, can be seen as a first step in fostering more skilled individuals ready for a globalized world. So let me briefly talk about Japan's financial sector in relation to the asset building of households. Japan's household financial assets have increased steadily, reaching now 1,860 trillion yen at the end of June 2019. This is a recent figure. In this situation, there have been changes in both the household and the financial sectors. Household investment in financial assets other than deposit has been gradually observed. The financial industry is one of the industries that have been affected by the structural factor of a declining and aging population amid economic improvement. However, it has also seen steady progress in globalization and technological innovation. Ooh. Wow. I'm so sorry. My old habit dies very hard, so I not just keep talking. So let me just quickly conclude my talk. I'm so sorry. So Japanese financial institutions are increasingly extending their overseas operations. You can see in New York, of course, and making alliances with a wide variety of businesses, including so-called fintech firms to offer new services to customers. So now I would like to conclude my speech, and actually I still have, three more babies? That's impossible. Actually, can we skip that conclusion? I mean, that's not possible, but let me just briefly summarize my conclusion. So I think that I have, discussed the sort of positive changes and also the challenges we have. Now, so what I'm hoping is that we still have lots of potentials. So Japan still has untapped potential and room to reform and to improve in many fields. So I hope that once we unlock our potential to the fullest extent, we can overcome the challenges. And the next actual section, or the paragraphs, actually, I talk about the links between the monetary policy and the enhancement of economic growth potential, which is quite important and closer to my heart. Let me just briefly summarize my gist of my argument. I think that the monetary policy has a very important role to support sort of the initiatives of private economic entities. And of course, government must initiate economic growth policy to support and create an environment in which the private entities could grow their potentials. And the monetary policy affects that environment in several ways. One way is, of course, that we are now creating sort of a good sort of employment labor market condition, so that we don't really that's now focus on deflation issue, and we can move on to more challenges like the challenge I have described, and also that's if the younger people cannot get jobs, they have less chance to develop their knowledge and skills. After all that, we learn something and lots of things by just working and by participating in the labor markets. So in that sense, monetary policy is just helping the people to develop those skills and potentials. And also this goes for the firms. That's if the room temperature is so cold, you just shiver. So the role for the monetary policy is to adjust the room temperature as the exactly sort of the appropriate temperature, so that the people and firms can move around and actively. So in the conclusion, that Japan has experienced stagnation and deflation for a long time. That the Bank of Japan aims at achieving price stability, thereby contributing to the sound development of national economy. This is, by the way, written in the Bank of Japan law. From now on, when a children's book is written, I would prefer not to see a phrase such as "it is a very difficult place to live," because there has been a decades-long stagnation. Okay. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for.
Fortunately for us today, Mr. Wakatabe said he does not just have to rush out the door, and he can spend some more time with us so we can ask him our own questions for a period here. And first of all, thank you for, I love the chart with people, what is it, walking faster and having more teeth.
Yes,
it's one of my favorite ones.
Yeah,
Seen that one before. And I just want to say.
That's the best chart I have.
When it's your turn to ask a question, keep them short, number one. I want everyone to identify themselves, your name, if your organization, if you belong to one, and wait for the mic to come. I, as the moderator, get to ask a couple of quick ones. And since you kind of flew through, well, you did talk a bit about monetary policy, and I think the whole presentation about meeting the demographic headwinds in so many ways leads me to this question, because Japan has clearly gone from, deflation to inflation, stagnation, to moderate growth. But now we're all of a sudden, all these wonderful trends, it's a trade war, and it's a global trade war, and it's hitting not just Japan, it's hitting everybody. At this point, in order to, you said in your speech, in your prepared remarks, you say Japan can go ahead, BOJ, meet the 2% inflation target. Does more need to be done now to do that, to maintain price momentum, to hit that 2%?
Okay. First of all, I think that we made it clear that first of all that we still maintaining the momentum, But if there is sort of potential danger to maintain that momentum, we would act accordingly, appropriately. And in that sense, that we are going towards sort of a more accommodative stance than we have now, if that happens. Okay, so that much is clear. So, speaking about sort of the current situation more broadly, the trade issue is really hitting all the economies. Japan is no exception. And you may actually argue that that trade issue at some point in time may not affect Japan in a bad manner, because lots of things can happen when that trade tension emerges. So, but overall, I think the picture is the one of sort of risks, downturns, downside risks, and uncertainties. So that we are quite aware that we should deal with this situation. And by the way, this trade tension is probably the part of the larger picture of the U.S.-China, not conflict, but more or less like a competition, rivalry. Okay, so that the intellectual property rights and all sorts of the rule maintaining are the part of the larger picture. The trade tension is just a manifestation of this large trend. So having said that, so that means we have to expect that this will go on for quite some time. So that in that sense, that we have seen dark clouds, and dark clouds are gathering their momentum. So the question for us is that dark clouds is really threatening our momentum to maintain to reach a 2% target. So we are kind of debating, and we are assessing that data quite closely. And I cannot really tell that's our conclusion, because that we are still So,
right. I also want to ask you about, because in your prepared remarks you mentioned that QQE, quantitative and qualitative easing, was a big factor lifting Japan out of the long period, from the late 1990s through early 2010. And one of the big innovations, among many, that the Bank of Japan has done was negative rates, 2016.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So obviously then part of achieving those goals as you look at those charts. So what is your view of how they fit into this picture of, hurting, helping? Some people have been critical. Some people think they have definitely been effective. The world's talking about negative rates now.
Yeah,
ECB,
exactly.
maybe even in the US. Have they worked, and would you be in favor of using them again?
Well, I mean, that's we are keeping it now, so that means that you believe that is an accommodative measure. So that's we believe negative interest rate policy is effective, and it has been helping. So I have just touched upon the QQE because I didn't have time to talk about the other aspects of the current policy framework of the BOJ. But after that, that we have introduced negative interest rate policy back in January 2016, and we have also introduced yield curve controls. Sorry about the technical jargon if you are not familiar with that. In the September 2016, and I believe that's the whole package to sustain the sort of the momentum for price stability goal, to reach the price stability goal, and to that's the sustained economic growth. And I believe, and we believe at the BOJ, that the good signs are showing up in that's in the chart we show. So that in that sense, that our policy has been working and has been effective. Now, as for the next move, from now on, that much is clear. Many people, we are aware that there are some people who are not happy with a negative interest rate policy. But that policy, we believe that it's been working, and we have introduced some sort of measures to cushion the sort of the negative impact of the particular policy, negative interest rate policy. And I think that is working. So that if we go further, we can obviously think about reconsider those sort of cushions, the measures to mitigate sort of the so-called negative effects. So that in that sense, that we still have options, and we would do, those options. We would use those options if it's necessary.
And just to clarify, it's something you'd be in favor of. You think that would be effective to make negative rates more negative?
Well, that's if you're asking my personal opinion, that I cannot disclose my personal preference. I mean that's now the negative interest rate policy is a part of the package, so that you should think about the whole package, not the piece of that the package. So in a sense that it's working, that I am in favor of it. But if you say that negative interest rate, is there any other sort of options available other than negative interest rate policy? That's the conclusion we have is we have the negative interest rate policy because it has worked and it's still working. So we cannot really answer that. Can we do, that in a hypothetical world, do a better sort of policy measure or something? But I think that this much is really true and clear. We don't want to continue low interest rate or negative interest rate policy for longer term. Okay. The circumstances, that's kind of, that's require the BOJ to pursue this package. Okay, but in the ideal world, we'd like to, reach a 2% inflation target, and we'd like to get out of this negative interest rate policy as soon as we can. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we are rushing to the exit. Okay, but this much is clear because we don't want to maintain low for longer to become low for forever policy. That's a kind of consensus we been shared. It's consensus shared by other central bankers all over the world.
Let's open up the audience now. And remember, keep your questions short and identify yourself and wait for the mic to reach you. Let's start with somebody on the aisle to get to a question quickly, and then we'll come back to you, sir. Who's on the aisle who had his hand up? That's you, I believe, sir. And then woman, or let's start with you and go to you and then to you.
Yes.
Sure. Hi, my name is Mark Zashin, and the question I have for you is that, hypothetically, based on your personal opinion, let's say Japan experiences some financial crisis. What tools does the Bank of Japan have to deal with that, assuming that you have negative rates? And do you have to pay attention to what the fiscal policies are?
Should I answer the question, or should we reject
Well, let's just maybe go question by question. Just kind of go quickly around. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you ask me a kind of precarious question. I mean, we cannot really talk about the financial crisis, but hypothetically speaking, but of course that's the major one of the major functions of having a central bank is to be prepared for financial crisis, obviously. So we have a bunch of sort of tools to deal with that. So we can inject, for example, liquidity. And now, of course, besides that, we have sort of macro-prudential policies, which have been sort of shared by the Financial Services Agency in Japan and the Bank of Japan. And we have a monitoring system. And of course, we have sort of monetary policy. If that's financial crisis turns to become economic crisis, we so we don't hesitate to utilize our monetary policy tools, and obviously tools we can of course discuss the effectiveness, shortcomings, the merits and demerits of each and particular policy. But that's as I said, we have options, so that we can utilize these options. Now, of course, we don't disclose which, because it really depends on the situation. Okay, what kind of crisis, financial or economic, we are going to have. Now, about the fiscal policy, that's we don't really talk about the fiscal policy because that's not our jurisdiction. But generally speaking, now of course that's whenever a crisis hits, what we need is kind of policy coordination. That much is clear. I think that's a kind of universal truth. So that fiscal policy authorities and the monetary policy authorities should cooperate to tackle the crisis situation. So that's obvious.
Okay, and the lady next to you.
Hi, Linda Zhang from Purview Investments. I have a question for negative interest rate. Recently, ECB has cut interest rate from negative to more negative, and they're going to start a new fresh round of QE in November. So they essentially have out Japan.
They have already out Japan.
Yes, the 10-year rate is already much lower than Japan's.
Okay.
So what advice would you have for ECB and German Chancellor? Thank you.
Oh wow! Okay. Well, I'm not in a position to advise German Chancellor or the ECB, but generally speaking, I think that it's very presumptuous to advise them because we're kind of learning from each other. I think the ECB and the Fed here and all other central banks have learned very important lesson, I believe, from Japan. We are now, we are now talking about Japanification, Japanization once again, in a sort of, it's rather unfortunate circumstances. But I would say, that now that this goes back to my talk, but I think I haven't talked about sort of the whatever happened in last decade or what initiated last 2 decades. I think that the quick action is very essential. So when you have that's when you expect something bad to happen, it's rather good to act sooner rather than later. And also policy coordination is extremely important, not only with fiscal authorities, but with macroprudential authorities. So you should have a sort of a whole sort of team of authorities to tackle crisis situation. And speaking of that, you should need a sort of public understanding and the backing. Okay, so you should need a sort of a public understand that this crisis may turn out very bad, from bad to worse. So that's hypothetically speaking. What I would say is that that you should have a sort of good understanding about the danger of one country or one jurisdiction could easily go into a deflation period, and that deflation would stifle the people's the vitality, and that could have a sort of longer lasting effect on the economy. So you should act sooner rather than later.
Okay, gentlemen, let's get this gentleman here. I think he was the first one to raise his hand, and we'll get a couple more there. Identify yourself, please. Keep the question short.
Thank you. Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors International and New York University. I'd like to divert a little bit and ask you, because of your excellent comments about the labor markets, I'd like to focus on that. My question is, since you're talking about a obviously continued trend of women and seniors getting involved in the Japanese labor market, can you please comment a little bit about, number one, the industries that they're going into, and more specifically, if you have an opinion as to how that growth can be used to fuel the climate change fight in terms of getting women and seniors more involved in Japan in terms of renewable energy and the industries that are involved in transition away from fossil fuels. Thank you.
That's an intriguing question. I mean, that's for the second question first, I don't know much about that connection. But that's an intriguing question I should take a look at. Generally speaking, I think that there is a growing sort of concern or consensus about the possible dangers from climate change among the Japanese people. And I can't really say that which age cohort is more sort of worried about climate change. You know, that's broadly speaking, I think that this is just a kind of anecdotal evidence. That's younger people should be more worried about this thing because that younger people would be more affected by this climate change down the road. So in that sense, you know that the seniors may not fit into that picture. You know that they must have some concerns of climate change, but that is not really driving force for change sort of energy policy in Japan or not. That is not clear to me. I mean, that's maybe, you know, that the younger generation may have more impact on Japan's energy policy. But that's my question, the kind of tentative answer to your second question. I think you were, you know, pointing out sort of what would change Japan's energy policy. You know, that what change comes from which age cohort. The short answer is I don't know, you know, exactly. So for the first question, I think that usually I think non-manufacturing sectors, service sectors. Yeah, and but we see some, I think, the female workers working at construction and transportation. So in a sense, that many everywhere. So you know that if you come to Tokyo and take, for example, JR Yamanote line, okay, or the JR other sort of the railways. You occasionally hear a female voice. The conductor of the particular train is just female now. So I think you see the female and women and seniors everywhere. But I think that's not so in the manufacturing sectors yet. I would say that non-manufacturing sectors, service industries. Yeah.
Could you get the mic over to this gentleman in the middle? He's been eagerly raising his hand, and we'll get, you just have to pass it down or something. That's, yeah. Okay, great.
Dwayne Rice Mason, Japan Society member.
I'm sorry, where did you say you were from?
I'm a member of the Japan Society.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, nice to meet you, sir.
Thank you.
The Bank of Japan has a stock of about $3 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the United States will be running multi-trillion-dollar deficits throughout the next 10 years.
Oh, okay.
Are U.S. Treasuries still a good bet, and will the Bank of Japan continue to buy them?
Oh, yeah, the JGBs, you mean that?
Yeah, the Bank of Japan.
Okay.
Will you hold on to them?
Will the BOJ buy JGBs?
U.S. Treasuries, will they keep
Treasuries,
holding
yeah,
on
yeah.
to them? Are they a good bet? Is it safe, you know, under these multi-trillion-dollar deficit conditions?
Oh, I think there are several questions in your
Yeah.
question, but I think that's the first of all. Now, of course, that's if you're talking about the BOJ's policy of the large-scale asset purchases of JGBs, I mean,
Japanese
government bonds.
No. U.S. government treasuries.
Oh, no,
their stock of U.S. government treasury
Oh,
bonds.
no. I mean, we don't buy U.S. treasuries
Okay.
for policy purposes. I mean, we have a different entity. You know, the what we call the Gaitame Tokai. That's a foreign exchange reserve fund, which has been under the control of the Ministry of Finance, and you know, and that oversees the foreign exchange intervention and foreign exchange policy. Okay, so there is a clear division between the BOJ and that fund, and the BOJ is a sort of agent through which, you know, that fund can order some you know, as purchases or selling of you know, the treasuries, but that's not our sort of initiative. And so given that institutional setting that we have no intention of buying up, U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah. And same thing for the Federal Reserve. Do we have any other? Oh, there's a question there in the middle, and then we'll go to the lady on the end, or this gentleman right here. That gentleman over there.
I'm Michael Schulp. I work at Fujisan-kei Communications. I understand the Japanese population is shrinking, and there's this reluctance to allow immigration. So two things. First of all, I have friends in Japan who swear that when they go into Konbini or 7-Elevens, there are always foreigners working there. So are there really no foreigners working in Japan, and do you think it's possible for this present economy to continue thriving without immigration in the future?
Right. The first question, I think that the government has recently changed the policy stance toward foreign guest workers. Now, the official formal line of the Japanese government is that we don't have a sort of immigration policy, so that that we don't that we welcome foreign guest workers, but they are under sort of certain conditions. So they cannot really, basically they cannot bring family members, and they have to stay in a certain sort of industries where the labor shortage is quite acute. But the government has relaxed that condition a little bit, so that for a certain segment of those who come as foreign guest workers can stay in Japan for longer, and they could actually bring the family member. With some requirements required, fulfilled. Now, that has been known among the Japanese public, and that your example is just perfect. I mean, that every time we go to the so-called convenience, that the person, that person may come from Myanmar or the Tibet or Turkmenistan or Tajikistan, lots of people, and partly because they are students. I mean, Japan has a kind of interesting system to make sort of studying in Japan more attractive to foreign students. The government has allowed a certain number of working hours for those foreign students studying in Japan. Okay, so that's a kind of good sort of way to sort of provide sort of labor force there. So that has been known, and the government has changed relaxed that. Beyond that, now of course that we have an argument, the discussion about the sort of future vision, what kind of Japan we'd like to have. So I would say that having more sort of foreign workers is a step towards making Japan more open to foreigners. Not to the Japanese domestic citizens. But then again, that's what I show, is that what really matters is not necessarily the number of people working, but the sort of knowledge and skills of those people working. So in that sense, that what we should ask is that what kind of society we would like to have in the future. That's what kind of contributions to our society, to Japan, we'd like to have from foreign sort of workers. So we'd like to welcome more. So what kind of foreign workers we'd like to welcome more? So that's still part of the discussions, and we are going to have a series of discussions down the road. But it has just begun.
All right. Well, we must conclude, I'm sorry to say, because I know we could all listen all afternoon, and you've been very generous with your time. I want to, I had a chance to look at all the slides of the presentation. There's it's all going to be on the website, you said? The Bank of Japan website? Right. Terrific information, and it just tells this story so clearly, and I think has some maybe some optimistic notes that people might not have expected. So I think we've all learned something today, and thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks to be invited to have this honor of moderating this event with Masazumi Wakatabe. Hope we can do it again.
Thank you.
Thank you.